I never thought a celebratory dinner at the Clarendon would end with my mother-in-law demanding I hand over my late grandmother's priceless emerald necklace, while my own husband sat silently beside her. And I certainly never expected the look of pure shock on Eleanor Harrington's face when my personal security team materialized at our table just 90 seconds after I pressed the hidden button on my bracelet. Please stay with me as I tell you my story. This moment shattered 3 years of careful manipulation and became the catalyst that transformed me from a compliant wife into the CEO who would reclaim my family's legacy. The Harringtons chose the Clarendon for Wallace's birthday dinner. The chandeliers glowed, violins played softly in the corner, and the waitstaff moved like ghosts through the room. Everything about the setting screamed old-money Philadelphia elegance. I tried to fit into that polished picture, smiling politely, sipping my wine, and wearing my grandmother Isabella's emerald necklace, a piece that meant far more to me than any of them could understand. Halfway through the meal, Eleanor leaned forward with her signature smile, the kind that was supposed to pass for kindness but always carried a hidden blade. She touched her pearls lightly and said, "Darling, that necklace is far too valuable for such a casual dinner. It really should be safeguarded in the Harrington family vault. We wouldn't want something so important to be misplaced." Her words were coated in honey, but her eyes left no doubt. This wasn't a suggestion. I looked to Preston, praying for even a hint of support, but he gave a small shrug and chuckled. "Chloe, it's just jewelry. Mom's right. Better safe than sorry. Don't make this a big deal." In that instant, every ounce of hope I had for him vanished. He wasn't protecting me. He wasn't even neutral. He was part of the plan. It hit me all at once. This wasn't about an heirloom necklace. It was the last move in a campaign that had been unfolding since the day I married Preston. Slowly, carefully, they had been stripping me of control over Vasquez Imports, the company my grandmother built with her bare hands. First, they told me to step back from day-to-day work so I could focus on being a wife. Then, decisions started happening without me. Now, they wanted the necklace, the last visible piece of my grandmother's legacy. Eleanor's voice sharpened. The fake sweetness evaporated. "I'm not asking, Chloe. That necklace belongs in our vault, where it will be safe. Hand it over." I felt my pulse racing, but instead of panic, clarity washed over me. This was the line. Quietly, under the white linen tablecloth, I pressed the small button on my bracelet. A simple habit from my CEO days, a panic alert linked directly to my security team. I never dreamed I would use it in the middle of a family dinner. Seconds later, the grand doors of the dining room opened. Marcus Thorne, my head of security, walked in with 2 associates, each dressed in tailored black suits. Their entrance was calm, measured, but their presence shifted the entire room. Marcus looked at me, not Eleanor, and asked, "What would you like us to do, Miss Sterling?" Silence fell over the table. Wallace's fork clattered against his plate. Eleanor's mouth opened, then closed, her composure cracking. Preston's face turned crimson, torn between outrage and disbelief. I pushed my chair back slowly, letting the legs scrape against the polished floor. Standing tall, I looked straight at Eleanor. "I won't be handing over anything tonight." Then I turned to Marcus. "Let's go." The 3 men flanked me as we walked through the dining room, past tables of curious diners who could sense the tension in the air. I didn't look back. The Harringtons sat frozen, stunned that their carefully spun web had finally snapped. That night at the Clarendon, I set the first boundary. They thought they could erase me quietly, but they underestimated the woman Isabella Vasquez raised. And as I walked out with my security team, emeralds shining against my collarbone, I knew the war had only just begun. When I left the Harringtons at that dinner table, I didn't go back to their house. Instead, I told Marcus to take me straight to Vasquez Imports. The city lights blurred past the car windows, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was heading somewhere that belonged to me. I couldn't shake the thought of how easily I had allowed them to edge me out. It hadn't happened overnight. It started with small suggestions from Preston and Eleanor, telling me I should focus on charity work, or that I had more important duties as Preston's wife. At first, I told myself it was temporary, that stepping back a little wouldn't hurt. But each step back became another door closing until I was standing outside of the company my grandmother built, watching others make choices in my place. When we pulled up to the building, the sight of it struck me. The glass tower still carried the Vasquez name, but it didn't feel the same. I walked into my office, and even though some of my grandmother's books and photographs were still there, the room felt colder, almost foreign, like someone else had been using it in my absence. Marcus stood near the door, his presence steady, while I sat down at the desk that once felt like the center of my world. My grandmother had been careful. She always believed in protecting what she built. Years ago, she installed a secure system that only I could access, requiring my fingerprint and retina scan. I hadn't used it in months, but tonight I did. As soon as the screen lit up, I felt a strange mix of fear and determination. The files I opened showed me more than I ever imagined. My signature appeared on documents I had never seen before. Whole contracts had been signed in my name, redirecting shipments, adjusting prices, and cutting ties with longtime partners. Emails that should have come to me had been rerouted to Preston. Meeting minutes showed me attending sessions I was never even told about. It was like I had been erased, my name used only as a cover while they pulled the strings. The deeper I looked, the clearer it became. Preston and Wallace hadn't just been pushing me aside. They were bleeding the company into Harrington businesses. Deals were made that gave the Harringtons the advantage while Vasquez Imports took the loss. This wasn't negligence. It was deliberate. They weren't only trying to silence me. They were using everything my grandmother created to cover their own tracks. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It wasn't just betrayal from a husband. It was a scam planned with precision. I realized I had been treated not as a partner, but as an obstacle. Everything I had thought was shared in my marriage was just a means to gain control. My phone buzzed again and again. Preston's name flashed across the screen. At first, his voice was soft, pretending to worry, telling me to come home. When I didn't agree, his tone changed, sharp and angry. He said the family was waiting, that I owed them an apology for embarrassing them at dinner. His words made my decision easier. I told him I wasn't coming back, that I knew what he and his family had done, and that my lawyers would handle it. Before he could shout another word, I ended the call. I turned to Marcus and asked him to arrange a hotel suite for the night. I couldn't risk stepping foot in that house again. Sitting there in my office, staring at years of lies hidden in plain sight, I understood something clearly for the first time. This wasn't just about protecting my grandmother's company anymore. It was about reclaiming myself. The Harringtons thought they had broken me, but they had no idea what I was about to become. That night marked the beginning of a fight I knew I was ready for. The hotel room was quiet, the kind of silence that made every thought louder. I sat on the edge of the bed with my laptop open, my hands steady as I typed the codes only my grandmother had shared with me. The screen flickered, and then her private digital vault appeared. It was a space I had almost forgotten existed, something she had set up years ago but told me to only open when I felt completely lost. Tonight was that moment. The first file I opened was a letter. My grandmother's words appeared on the screen, and for a moment, it felt like she was sitting beside me again. She wrote that she had always worried about the Harringtons. To them, I wasn't a wife or a partner. I was a key, a way to access everything Isabella Vasquez had built. She told me not to let anyone dull my light, not to forget who I was or where I came from. Reading her words filled me with both warmth and sorrow. She had seen what I had refused to acknowledge. Another file carried a name that caught my breath, Project Guardian. It was her plan in case the family ever tried to trap me. To my surprise, Marcus was part of it from the beginning. He hadn't just been a bodyguard. He had been chosen by my grandmother as someone she trusted to protect not only me, but also the company. Encrypted logs appeared next, files Marcus had been quietly keeping for years. Every suggestion Eleanor made, every moment Preston pushed me out of my role, had been recorded. My grandmother had anticipated everything, and Marcus had made sure her plan lived on. Scrolling further, I opened financial documents that left me stunned. For years, Preston had shown me reports painting Vasquez Imports as weak, struggling, and in need of support. But the truth was the complete opposite. The company was thriving, contracts were strong, revenue was steady, and its global reputation was unshaken. The false reports were designed to make me doubt myself, and to make a takeover look like a rescue. It wasn't neglect on my part, it was a deliberate illusion. I pressed a hand over my face, and tears came. Not out of defeat, but because I felt my grandmother's love reaching me even now. She had left me tools, guidance, and the strength I had forgotten I carried. I wasn't blind because I was weak. I had been blind because I wanted to believe love meant loyalty. She had known better. The emerald necklace lay on the nightstand beside me. I picked it up and held it tightly. It wasn't just a beautiful stone. It was a reminder of a woman who had built everything with grit, vision, and endless determination. Wearing it meant I carried her with me. It was a symbol of power, not decoration. Wiping my tears, I reached for my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. Evelyn Reed answered, her voice as sharp as I remembered. She had always distrusted the Harringtons, and my grandmother had trusted her completely. I didn't waste words. I told her it was time, that Project Guardian had to move forward. There was a pause, and then Evelyn said she would assemble her team immediately. I could hear the certainty in her voice. For the first time in months, I felt steady. I ended the call and looked around the quiet hotel room. Everything was about to change. I whispered the words aloud as if my grandmother could hear me. I want my company back. And this time I meant every syllable. The next morning, I sat in the hotel suite waiting for Evelyn Reed. When she walked in, she didn't come alone. Behind her was a group of sharp-looking lawyers and forensic accountants carrying files and laptops. They got straight to work, and within hours, papers were being prepared and signed. That same day, Preston and the Harringtons were served with a temporary restraining order. It blocked them from touching Vasquez Imports accounts or systems. Their sudden grip on the company had been cut off in one swift strike. The Harringtons, of course, didn't stay silent. They came back quickly with their own attack. Their lawyers filed a motion claiming I was unfit to run the business. They painted me as unstable, pointing to what happened at the dinner as proof. They said calling security on family was a sign that I was paranoid, even dangerous. Eleanor's spin made me out to be a woman losing control, and they wanted Preston appointed as conservator over my assets. To make their case stronger, they brought in a psychiatrist who often worked with families like theirs. He was ready to write whatever supported their claim. That stress had clouded my judgment, that I wasn't in the right frame of mind to handle responsibility. It was a carefully staged performance meant to make me look incapable. Evelyn was always 2 steps ahead. She arranged for me to meet a respected specialist, someone known for being fair and thorough. I sat through hours of testing, answering every question with clarity. When the evaluation was done, the results showed exactly what we already knew. I was fully competent. There was nothing wrong with me except that I refused to be controlled. Armed with this, Evelyn and her team marched into court. We laid out the evidence. Signatures faked on contracts, hidden emails, secret decisions made without my knowledge. Marcus's detailed records showed a pattern of manipulation that was impossible to ignore. Every page told a story of deception and greed. The judge listened carefully, and after reviewing everything, he denied the Harringtons' request. Their motion to have me declared unfit was dismissed, and I retained full control of Vasquez Imports while the investigation continued. It was a victory, but I knew it was only the first round. That evening, as I tried to breathe easier for the first time in days, Preston appeared at the hotel. He showed up with flowers in hand and a smile I had once fallen for. He spoke softly, telling me we could forget everything if I just came home. He promised it could be like before, that all of this fighting was unnecessary. It was the same tactic he always used, sweet words after betrayal. But this time I saw him clearly. I told him the truth he never wanted to hear, that our marriage had been nothing more than a transaction to him, a way to gain what my grandmother left me. I told him the deal was over, and there was no turning back. His face hardened, the charm slipping away, but I didn't flinch. I called Marcus, and within minutes, Preston was escorted out of the building. The sight of him leaving didn't bring joy, only certainty. The legal ground was secure, but I knew Eleanor and her family would not stop there. They had money, influence, and pride on the line. Winning in court was just one battle. The next would be fought in places where whispers, appearances, and reputations mattered. And I was ready. The Harringtons did not take their defeat in court quietly. Eleanor turned to the one arena where she always held influence, society. Through whispers at luncheons, charity events, and private gatherings, she painted Chloe as unstable and ungrateful. People who once smiled warmly at Chloe now avoided her gaze, their opinions shaped by Eleanor's carefully planted words. Soon, invitations that once came weekly stopped arriving, and calls from old acquaintances went unanswered. The doors of Philadelphia's elite circles were shutting on her, just as Eleanor had planned. Preston played his part with ease. He appeared at galas on Eleanor's arm, always charming and polished, photographed beside a well-bred socialite who fit the Harrington image. Their closeness was splashed across society pages, fueling speculation that Chloe had already been replaced. For a moment, the weight of it all pressed hard on Chloe. The silence from people she once trusted, and the staged smiles of her husband cut deep. This isolation was exactly the trap they had set for her, to make her believe she had no life outside their approval. But Chloe refused to bend. Instead of mourning the loss of hollow friendships, she looked inward and remembered who she was before the Harringtons tried to mold her. She reached out to the global partners her grandmother had nurtured for decades, people who respected Isabella Vasquez's vision. At Vasquez Imports headquarters, she welcomed them personally, showing not only the company's stability, but also its growth potential under her guidance. The energy in the room reminded her of the strength she had forgotten she carried. Her next move was bold. She sat down with a respected business journal and spoke openly about the struggles women faced in leadership, especially when married into powerful families that expected them to shrink. Without mentioning the Harringtons directly, her words painted a picture that resonated with entrepreneurs and executives worldwide. The article gained traction quickly, reframing her in the public eye, not as a social exile, but as a woman fighting for her rightful place. Slowly, the gossip began to lose power. People started to see two sides of the story: the Harringtons' polished but shallow narrative, and Chloe's honest account of resilience. Business leaders reached out with support, while social elites whispered with uncertainty about which version of events to believe. Chloe realized she did not need their approval. She was no longer willing to beg for a seat at a table that had been designed to diminish her. Instead, she chose her own ground. Chloe began shaping a new vision for Vasquez Imports, one rooted in her grandmother's values and her own heritage. Where Eleanor had once urged her to suppress her Mexican identity for the sake of fitting in, Chloe now embraced it. She commissioned projects that highlighted authentic culture, expanded partnerships with Latin American artisans, and celebrated the story of Isabella's journey from nothing to building an empire. The Harringtons had tried to exile her socially, but Chloe discovered freedom in rejection. She no longer needed their acceptance because she was building a world that was hers alone, one stronger, truer, and untouchable by their schemes. With full access to my company's records, I asked Evelyn's team to go through everything with a fine-tooth comb. What they uncovered shook me to my core. The Harrington Empire, which always paraded itself as unshakable, was rotting from the inside. Wallace's main company had been bleeding for years because of reckless investments. Their interest in Vasquez Imports was never about growth. It was about survival. They needed my grandmother's company to rescue them from collapse. I felt sick realizing the truth. For years, they'd played me with smiles, lectures, and false concern, when all along I had been their target. My role as a Harrington wife had been nothing more than a cover for their desperation. They hadn't wanted me at their table. They wanted what was mine. But the deeper we dug, the more painful it became. The accountants showed me how Preston had been siphoning small sums from Vasquez for years. Designer clothes, luxury trips, the perfect image of a successful man, all funded by money he quietly stole. He must have thought he could bury it once he had full control. Seeing the proof made my stomach twist. Our marriage had been a performance, and I had been financing the stage. The part that broke me wasn't even the money, it was the betrayal. I thought at the very least Preston saw me as his partner. Instead, I was nothing more than his financial safety net. Every promise, every tender moment, had been part of a strategy. I confronted him over the phone, making sure the call was recorded. His mask slipped within seconds. He didn't apologize, didn't even try. He screamed at me, told me I was difficult, and accused me of destroying everything because I wouldn't play along. That was who he really was, entitled, bitter, and convinced that marrying me meant he had a right to everything I owned. In that moment, I understood the dinner fight over my grandmother's emerald necklace. It wasn't about family heritage or appearances. That piece was liquid wealth, something they could sell quickly to patch their crumbling finances. They weren't just trying to steal my company. They wanted to strip me down to nothing, piece by piece. Now the tables had turned. I had every shred of proof: embezzlement, forged documents, the financial trail, even Preston's unhinged rant. I wasn't just prepared to defend myself anymore. I was armed to take them down completely. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of them. But as I stared at the evidence, a question weighed heavily on me. Was it enough to protect Vasquez Imports and walk away stronger? Or should I use this power to burn their empire to the ground? I finally had the choice, and whichever path I took would define not just their fate, but mine. I knew it was time to stop playing defense. I called an emergency board meeting at Vasquez Imports and laid out everything we had uncovered. Every forged signature, every false report, every missing dollar. It was all there in black and white. The room went silent as I explained how Preston and his family had used me and my company to try to cover up their own failures. Even the Harrington allies on the board couldn't deny the truth staring them in the face. I put forward a motion to cut all ties with Harrington Holdings and their subsidiaries. I made it clear that Vasquez Imports would not just distance itself, but also seek damages for the money Preston had stolen and the losses caused by their schemes. When the votes were cast, the motion passed. In that moment, the Harringtons were officially locked out of my company. Their access was gone, and the lawsuits waiting for them were heavy enough to shake the foundation of everything they owned. But I didn't stop there. While they scrambled to figure out their next move, I quietly used Vasquez Imports' resources to buy up large portions of Harrington Holdings' debt on the secondary market. Piece by piece, I became one of Wallace Harrington's biggest creditors. He had once lectured me about duty and family pride, but now he was at my mercy. I arranged a meeting and laid out his options. Either he accepted a structured settlement, which meant selling off prized possessions, the family estate, their art, their assets, or he could refuse and face a public bankruptcy that would shatter the Harrington name forever. Wallace tried to posture, tried to remind me who they were, but the numbers spoke louder than his pride. He had no choice but to surrender. The dynamic had shifted completely. The man who once treated me as insignificant now had to bow to me. The Harrington estate that had always been dangled over my head was on the chopping block, their art collection reduced to auction items. It wasn't revenge in the form of shouting or humiliation. It was precise, quiet justice. Preston didn't escape the fallout either. His own family turned on him, cutting him off financially. To them, he was the failure who let their plan collapse, the man who couldn't even manage his wife. For someone who lived off their wealth and validation, the sudden emptiness around him must have been unbearable. Later that evening, I stood in my office as the news ran a story about the Harringtons' strategic asset realignment. The anchors used careful words, but I knew the truth behind them, collapse disguised as restructuring. I didn't smile, and I didn't celebrate. There was no joy in watching them fall, only the steady weight of justice finally catching up. For the first time, I wasn't looking at life through the lens of survival. I was standing on my own, holding the power they once tried to steal, and I wasn't giving it back. Eleanor didn't disappear quietly the way the others had. She demanded a meeting, as if her name alone still carried weight. I agreed, but on my terms. She came to Vasquez Imports, stepping into my space with the same arrogance she had always carried, expecting the room to bend for her. Marcus stood nearby, a silent reminder that this was no longer her stage. She began the way I knew she would, not with remorse, but with blame. Her words dripped with control, carefully chosen to press guilt into me. She said I was tearing the family apart, that I was the reason their name was suffering, that by fighting back I was destroying a legacy that had stood for generations. She tried to make herself the victim, as if I should feel ashamed for defending what was mine. But I didn't flinch. I looked her in the eye and reminded her of everything she had done. Every time she mocked my background, every moment she told me to hide who I was, every attempt to make me small so that the Harrington name could stand taller. It all came spilling out. I spoke calmly, without raising my voice, and for the first time I saw her falter under the weight of her own actions. I told her the truth. The Harrington name was never built on honor. It was built on taking what belonged to others, on smoke and mirrors, on fear and pressure. The Vasquez name was different. My grandmother created something from nothing, building brick by brick, with real work and real sacrifice. One legacy was stolen, the other earned. Then I cut deeper. I told her I knew everything about their failing empire, about the debts they were drowning in, about how their attempt to steal my company wasn't power at all but desperation. That mask of superiority she wore so tightly cracked in front of me. For the first time, the woman who had once towered over every room looked small, exposed, and frightened. She tried to steady herself, but I didn't let her. I told her I pitied her, that all her posturing, her cruelty, her obsession with status had left her hollow. Pity was the last thing she wanted from me, but it was the only thing I felt. The mighty Eleanor Harrington wasn't untouchable. She was fragile, and she knew I could see it. She stood, gathering what little dignity she had left, and walked toward the door. Before she could leave, I gave her the final word she would ever hear from me. I told her the emeralds would stay with me because they belonged to a builder, not a thief. She froze for a moment, then left without another sound. That was the end. With her gone, the chapter with the Harringtons closed for good. Their shadow no longer touched me. I had reclaimed everything they tried to steal, and more importantly, I had reclaimed myself. When the battles ended, I finally had the chance to breathe. The lawsuits, the boardroom fights, the constant games from the Harringtons, they were behind me. The first thing I did was file for divorce. Thanks to the prenuptial agreement my grandmother insisted on, Preston was left with nothing. He had gambled our marriage as if it were a business deal, and now the deal was finished. With that chapter closed, I turned all my energy to Vasquez Imports, not as a title holder, not as someone playing a role, but as a leader who knew her purpose. I tore down the policies that had been put in place to favor the Harringtons and returned to the vibrant vision my grandmother had set years ago. The company wasn't just about numbers on a page. It was about people, culture, and pride in what we created. I filled the office with life again. The walls that had felt sterile under Harrington influence now displayed the colors and art my grandmother loved. Every corner reminded us of the roots we came from and the legacy we were carrying forward. The change wasn't just physical, the atmosphere shifted. Employees who had once looked over their shoulders now stood taller, knowing they were part of something real. Their loyalty came back with strength, and I could feel the morale rising around me. But I knew it wasn't enough to simply rebuild. I wanted to honor Isabella's memory in a way that reached beyond the walls of Vasquez Imports. That's when I launched the Isabella Vasquez Foundation, designed to give opportunities to women entrepreneurs, especially immigrants and first-generation business owners who faced the same uphill climb my grandmother once did. It wasn't charity. It was planting seeds for a future where more women could build without fear of being stripped of their work. The night of the foundation's launch gala, I stood in a room filled with people who believed in the mission. I wore my grandmother's emerald necklace, not as a jewel to flaunt, but as a symbol of strength, resilience, and everything that could not be taken from me. For the first time in years, I wasn't surrounded by those who judged my worth by my last name. I was embraced by people who valued my vision, my courage, and my determination to create something lasting. As I looked around that room, I knew I had become the woman my grandmother always believed I could be. I had walked through betrayal, humiliation, and heartbreak, and I had come out stronger. I carried her spirit with me, not as a memory, but as a living force in every decision I made. I also made peace with my past. My marriage had been painful, but it taught me the most important lesson of all. My boundaries were mine to protect, and my worth was never tied to anyone else's approval. I was no longer Chloe the victim. I was no longer Chloe the Harrington wife. I was Chloe Sterling, CEO of Vasquez Imports, and I was finally free. A year passed, and my world looked completely different. Vasquez Imports had not only survived but flourished. We broke into new markets, and instead of hiding behind someone else's name, we leaned on the truth of our story: immigrant roots, hard work, and resilience. That honesty became our strength, and people trusted us more than ever. Every so often, I heard whispers about the Harringtons. Their mansion, once a symbol of power, had been sold. They were living in a much smaller place, stripped of the image they had clung to for so long. Wallace's empire was nothing more than a shell now, struggling to stay relevant. Preston, who once bragged about his name opening every door, was working an ordinary job where nobody cared who he was. The elite circles he worshipped had forgotten him. As for Eleanor, she was almost invisible. Her pride couldn't handle the shame, so she stayed out of sight. Meanwhile, I found new ways to use my voice. My alma mater invited me back to speak, and I stood on that stage telling my story. Not bitter, not angry, but honest. I talked about holding on to identity, about the importance of independence, and about not letting anyone rewrite your worth. Afterward, a young woman came up to me. Her hands trembled as she said, "It's like you were telling my story. My boyfriend's family makes me feel the same way. Hearing you gave me courage. I know what I need to do now." Her words struck me more deeply than any victory in court. That was the moment I realized my journey wasn't just about justice for me. It was about lighting a path for others. Almost unconsciously, my hand touched my grandmother's emerald necklace. That small gesture always reminded me of her strength running through me. I looked out at the faces in the auditorium, and for the first time, I felt complete. The scars of the past were still there, but they no longer defined me. I finally understood. The greatest revenge isn't in tearing others down. It's in building a life so strong and true that those who tried to break you fade into the background. If you're in your own fight, remember this. Your worth is untouchable, your peace is priceless, and no one has the right to dim your light.